I'm delighted to have again as a guest my friend Nick Miller, who's the president of Clarity Advantage, and someone who has trained many bankers on how to have business conversations with business owners. I think your course, Nick, Talking Business with Business Owners, has probably been taken by, you tell me, tens of thousands of bankers.
I would say that's a bit of a stretch, Ned. Thank you. But it's certainly many thousands.
Well, we're gonna talk about talking business. Last time we were together, we talked about a conversation that we think bankers need to do a better job of. And it's the conversation about exit strategies and getting business owners talking a little bit about how they see their futures and what might be involved in whether they're going to transition their business to a family member, whether they might sell it to their employees, how this could work. And I guess one of the things that you said, which really stuck with me, is that for business people like you, like me, having this conversation is very natural. But we need to help bankers normalize, that was the word used, normalize the conversation in such a way that they're able to really draw out business owners. And when you think about asking questions, it's not just about gathering information, it's to help the business owners. It's to help them think through some questions and perhaps in that way develop a little better trust between you and the business owner. But this focus today, we're going to focus on the conversation. One of the big picture questions is how bank management ought to approach this issue, because there is clearly an element of getting people comfortable with this conversation. So it becomes a second nature kind of conversation. What kinds of things would you say? What advice would you give management when it comes to setting people up for success and raising the bar in terms of this particular topic?
Let's do that. But can we go back just to an earlier comment you made about making this natural?
Mhm.
Remember, there was a time much long ago when I was meeting with the guy who then called himself a stockbroker to talk about my retirement accounts. And we were meeting at a local hotel. It was a terrifically cold day. And we were meeting in the lobby, and we were both cold. And he came in and sat down and said, I know we're here to talk about your retirement accounts, but I just have one question for you. Okay, sure. What is that? Why do you have a full-time office manager? So this was really early in my business. Um, and the answer was, I don't need a full-time office manager. He says, well, there's all kinds of options available. Why don't you use one of those? It was transformational. I mean, at the time, the office manager I had at the time kind of knew that she wasn't working full time, and so we had a quick conversation, and she decided to go on. But it was really the first time any of my providers had questioned my basic assumptions about my business, and it truly was transformational. She left and found other work within a month. So just sort of a random question on a cold day turned out to be really helpful. So I know we're here to talk about a longer term view, but just the impact of that for me, how helpful it was to me
Mhm.
to have somebody ask that question at that time was huge. So fireworks like that don't go off every time you ask this kind of question, but I think the assumption is that we think business owners know what they're doing. And they do to some extent, but we all make assumptions, or we all put off, the end of life conversation about our business or ourselves. And so it's really helpful when somebody says, so, and we'll get to this later, but so what are you going to do with this? What are you trying to build here? How do you see this evolving? What does this mean to you and your family? Those kinds of questions, very few people ask those questions. So it's not always appropriate. I mean, you don't want to, it's like going to a bar and meeting somebody and saying, hey, you want to get married? It's like it's too early. You got to have a little bit of conversation first to establish some context. But I think those are questions that very few business owners are asked often enough
Mhm.
so that they really have a chance to think it through. So your question was, what should bank managers do um, to start raising the bar or moving in this direction? And my answer to that would be, don't start with the bankers.
Mhm.
I view this as a strategic question.
Mhm.
Which clients do we want to serve? What are the challenges they're having? Which of those challenges do we want to take on versus refer to outside experts? And for the ones that we want to take on, how are we going to do that?
Mhm.
So if we're going to take on some aspect of business transition or succession, those are the those are the questions. Which situations do we want to do and which not? If we're going to do them, how are we going to do them? And who in the bank is going to be involved and how are they going to work together so that you have a playbook, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what that leads to then is the ability to model that. So if we do this, what does this look like for us financially? And how would we communicate to our market that we're actually going to do this? There's a marketing communications issue. All of this runs sort of in a skunk works before you get to thinking about what are we going to have the bankers do?
Yeah. I think you're 100%
Unless
right. Yeah. Yeah.
unless you subscribe to the completely heroic banker model, and I'm not a fan of that. They're wonderful when you can find them, but there aren't that many. So if you really want to take this on, my view is you have to think it through strategically and structurally before you get to the bankers. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think there are heroic bankers or people that are good at this. I asked somebody this week whether in his area of the upper Midwest, whether there were any banks that were doing a good job of this. And he thought for a second, he said, banks, no. Bankers, yes. And what I think we're talking about here is raising to an appropriate level in an organization this strategic issue. This is one of the things that business owners tell us they're thinking about. And they're thinking about it because it's an immediate kind of issue for many of them. If they're planning to transition their business in the next decade, this is something that we should be curious about. I think this goes to your point about, the timing of asking the questions. A lot of people, I think, are thinking that you can put off this conversation until you've learned this, that, and the other thing, or spent years dealing with it. I think you could ask in the way you talked about it, sort of curiosity question that's born out of a sense that if you know some things about how they're thinking about their business, or if you are curious about certain things. Somebody told me a story, Nick, this past week about a business owner who had always assumed that his son was interested in taking over the business. And and when the banker posed the question, "Have you ever talked to your son about this?" The business owner said, "No." And the banker said, "I think you ought to do that. I think you ought to do that." And he did, and it came back that the son wasn't interested in taking on the business, which is again, to your point, it's a very valuable thing to know. May have not been the response that he particularly anticipated, but it was very relevant.
Must
So
have been a
go with me a
quiet
little
dinner
bit.
table conversation.
Exactly, exactly.
Oh,
So think with me a little bit. So if a bank comes to the conclusion that this is something that makes sense,
yep.
this is something that the bank as a whole is committed to doing, what's involved in getting everybody on the same page and trying to make this thing move forward at the right kind of pace?
So there's a couple of issues. The first is the process issues.
Hmm.
So just playing out who's who's going to be involved in providing what services and how are they going to dance together.
Hmm.
So if one of the relationship bankers has this conversation and gets the following answers, who's involved? Does
Hmm.
it go stick with the banker? Does it go to somebody in the wealth management area? Does it go to an attorney outside?
Hmm.
So really thinking through what are the likely forks in the discussion tree and where do they end up. So you got to do that first so that
Hmm.
when you get to the relationship banker, you know these are the plays or this is the role in this process that the generalist banker is going to play.
Hmm.
Too often I've seen people say, well, I mean, particularly for larger companies, oh, let's just give them some corporate finance training. Let's give them some of this training, that training. So yeah, that's good, and they always find value in it. But the question is, how do you execute the play
Hmm.
as an organization? Again, getting beyond the heroic banker model. So I think once you've decided that you're going to do this, you decide the banker's role. Is it ask a few questions and then you're going to refer it to somebody outside or somebody else inside the bank? So the few questions would be things like, what are you planning to do with your business? What do you think the trajectory looks like to get there?
Hmm.
What does this mean to you and your family? How does it all fit together? I mean, we can talk more about those questions, but they're relatively simple questions. And then if the business owner says, well, I'm planning to give it to my children or I'm planning to sell it, it's like, great. I'd like to introduce you to somebody at the bank or somebody outside that works with our clients on those sorts of issues. I think you'd really find their thoughts
Hmm.
helpful.
Hmm.
That's relatively easy. That's a 15-minute training program after you've worked out what the process is.
Mhm.
If you're going to expect that the generalist banker has more knowledge personally, so for example, you expect them to be able to speak, let's say, for 5 or 7 minutes about different ways to value a business
Mhm.
and what you need to be thinking about in terms of the potential buyers. There's strategic buyer, there's financial buyer, and so on. And
Mhm.
what are the multiples that typically are seen for businesses in your industry? And how would that vary from the strategic buyer to the financial buyer? If you expect bankers to have those conversations, you really need to break it down into pieces, and it has to be worth their while. I mean, I
Mhm.
think we're going to talk about why does this matter for a banker, but if this is the game they're playing and the compensation program lines up with this, then you have to break this down and give it to them in modules and test them. I mean,
Mhm.
basically, you have to say, all right, we're going to dry run that conversation. How does it sound? Here's the scenario, and practice, practice, practice. So nothing new. It's just you're adding new content. Instead of cash management, it's valuation methods. Um, but it's the same idea.
Which is another reason to think about the support that's going to be provided to bankers. I didn't say at the outset of this call that you were one of the founders of Vertical IQ, and Vertical IQ does include information about valuing businesses in a specific industry segment. That's something to be aware of if you're calling on somebody, and the expectation is that you might be called on to talk a little bit about it. So that's part of, again, a longer term strategy. When it comes to the issues of training bankers, we touched on this a little bit last time. One of the roles that's really critical in any sort of training is the follow up that's conducted by sales managers. So I guess part of this process has to involve, this is not just getting your bankers, your individual relationship managers up to speed. This is getting your sales managers up to speed and able to coach on some technical topics as well.
If you're going to market this way and it's part of the strategy, then it's not easy, but it's a little easier to say to your team leaders and region managers and so on, look, these are conversations that we need to be having. You're going to talk to your bankers about their credit opportunities and their cash management opportunities. You need to be talking to them about their conversations with business owners about their exit plans,
Mhm.
and have a way of tracking that so that you can follow it. So it's all part of the system. And yes, the first line managers really need to be asking that question. So when you met with Ned Miller, what'd you learn about his plans? Oh, we didn't talk about that. Okay, shorthand. Let me be clear. I'm expecting you to have that conversation. It's part of how we go to market. Any questions? So you do that a different way, of course, but it just has to be part of the standard.
Yeah, and the idea of inventorying, if the expectation is that you should know what the exit plans are for all of your major customers or all of your prospects, that's the kind of thing you have to build into your conversations, as you point out. It's also fair to say, I think that part of staying current with what's evolving in these areas might be relying not just on your learning and development team, but relying on the experts that perhaps you've built into your network. The people who might be affiliated with an accounting firm or a law firm or maybe an M&A advisory firm, bringing them in periodically to provide some sort of ideas about what may be going on as a way to continually refresh people's knowledge and also fine tune the questions they're asking, looking for triggers and opportunities like that.
Of course. I think just as you provide ongoing views of what's happening in the credit market and the bank's credit appetites and the capital markets and so on, yeah, you need to include this. I think one of the things that I think is important is, do your bankers are they curious? Do
Mm,
they like this conversation?
mm,
Um, I mean, I'm curious. I want to know. I'm very, it's like very easy for me to ask another business owner. So tell me about what you're building here. What's
mhm,
what's the vision for this?
mhm,
Um, because I'm interested. And I think some bankers are interested and others are not. And if you're interested, then you're reaching out to your lawyers and your CPAs and your M&A friends and so on to find out what's going on and what sorts of prices are you seeing and who's in the market at this point. It just becomes something that you follow because you're interested. I think
mhm.
if somebody isn't interested, they just want to do credit. I'm a credit person. It's very hard to get them to become broader. It's possible, but I've rarely seen that work.
I think you're right. And it does tie back to this thing that we've touched on, which is the revenue dynamics and how banks keep score. And the revenue question, it's how do you get somebody, uh, who's a who views himself or herself as a lender to think more broadly about the revenue streams of the bank. I think we've done a better job, certainly in the last decade, getting people to think about how treasury management not only can help in creating some recurring revenue, but I think we're getting people smarter about some of the other ancillary products, which can be quite profitable to a bank and think about that. So it does beg the question of how do we tie these things together?
Ned, you and I have both been in the industry a long time, long time. I would tell you that when I started in the banking industry in a bank, we were having these discussions about how are we going to generate more cash management, treasury management, fee income. It's a good opportunity. It doesn't involve the bank's capital. Now, that was 50 years ago. And we still, as an industry, haven't accomplished it, have not accomplished it. We're better, but we aren't there yet. So as you and I are having this discussion about, oh, let's talk to business owners about their exit plans, our children's children will be having this conversation. How do we get the industry to do that better? I, I, I'm not totally wrong here, let me say.
No, you're not at all, and I don't want to go into stories about trying to demo treasury management services as a weenie city banker in the 1970s with you. I'm sure we could tell some interesting stories because it was probably similar.
So
So
the
so
revenue
let's
thing here is
yeah.
interesting because if you ask this question, what are you trying to do with this thing? How do you see it evolving? What you have in front of you is an open door. It's like you can see the yellow brick road at that point. Okay, when are you thinking of selling? 7 years. What kind of money did you want to get for it? $10 million. Okay, so firms in your industry at this point are going for three times sales. So that's going to mean that you have $3 to $4 million in sales. Good sized small business. Let's talk about where you are now and how you get there.
Mhm.
What's that going to mean in terms of the assets that you're going to need? What's it going to mean in terms of cash flow? What's it going to mean in terms of people? Have you got that worked out? No. Well, let's just back of the envelope do that. Average revenue per person in your industry is $250,000. You want 3 million of revenue? You're going to have 12 people. You've got six now. Let's talk about that transition. It's not hard with some rules of thumb that you can get from vertical IQ to do that quick math. And the business owner's eyes roll back in the head and go, oh my goodness, I had no idea. Right. So let's now talk about sort of how you might phase that in, when you're going to need that equipment, and how you might finance it, and how we phase that in so you stay credit worthy. I mean, it's once you open that door, it's all there. And then let's talk about how you optimize your cash flow in the next couple of years to free up more so that you have it to invest in the people and the assets that you need. Oh my goodness. And do you have an estate plan? No. Well, let's talk about that. Do you have somebody watching out for the investments you're making? Yeah, okay, we could chat about that. I mean, it's you literally open up the whole bank once you ask the question, what are you trying to do with this thing? And how do you think you're going to get there? So I think, does it all happen in year one? No, it could be a 3 or 5 year plan. Oh gosh, a 3 or 5 year plan, relationship plan with this company? Holy cow, I'm interested. How much revenue? Don't know yet, but it'll be some every year.
Yeah.
So I just don't get the reluctance of bankers to ask the question because it's literally like somebody kicks the door open and you can see the whole picture.
I think you're right in that when
Who's
I think about
enthusiastic about this?
you are, and I think that's good. People need to know that there's enthusiasm in both of our quarters about this because I think it is an opportunity for for banks who really want to help focus their sales teams on something that's meaningful to their business owner clients and to prospects because it is a way to differentiate yourself. If you go in and are talking about things that incumbents aren't discussing, you look different, which is always one of the things that we try to strive for.
Well, you
So,
share some insights, right? I mean, it
yeah.
shows some thinking if you're able to say, sale prices are three times earnings, so much revenue per employee, so much revenue
Mhm.
per dollar of assets is what's typical. Takes a little pre-call planning to do that, but you're actually able to provide an insight at that point, which is valuable, as opposed to saying, so what are your capital expenditure plans and how'd you think you were going to finance it? And we want your operating account, of course, and I'll have my cash management specialist call you. Shoot me now.
Well, I think it's the thing that struck me as you were talking about it is that a lot of closely held businesses, owners, whatever generation they are, often think about keeping it in the family. And one of the things that we know often happens when the family's involved is that there are issues, and there are whole groups of consulting firms that assist dealing with these inter-family issues. But if somebody says my son is really excited about taking over the business, take that as a scenario, or my daughter, if you don't know the son or the daughter, that's an invitation to get to know them, or it could be an invitation. Yeah, so what do you think they're going to need to be successful? What kinds of
Right.
skills are they going to need to develop? And it could be a conversation that could move in a lot of different areas. There are bankers that have clearly been able to assist in that regard, helping the next generation capture some information and some skills. So
Yep.
so I
One,
want to. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
sorry, one of the things that I learned along the way is that if you want to have a saleable business, you have to build it as a saleable business, whether it's to your kids or to an outside buyer. So the questions that go with that, what aspects of your operation are building value, equity value, and which are not? Do you
Mhm.
have a full management team in place? And what are the gaps if you do or you don't? Where are you going to find those people? You need to work together 3 or 4 years before you'd be credible for a buyer. So you need to start the process 5 years ahead of time. I mean, just sizing out for somebody, this is the time frame, these are the requirements that we see. Can we talk about those and see how it makes sense? I mean, just broadening your example a little bit. If a banker knows only that, it's helpful.
One of the questions that often surprises business owners is the question about how do you take yourself out of this business and still retain value? And how are you going to get yourself out of this day to day, the kind of crazy life that you've led for X number of years? And even questions like that get people thinking. And I think that's where we're thinking there's tremendous value, but also the potential to find some support within your organization from partners or from outside the organization that will actually enhance your position. We're
Yeah.
not trying to turn generalists into specialists, but we are trying to get them uh, to the point where I think at the table for these conversations as perhaps the quarterback or an architect of some of the ongoing conversation.
Yeah. And I think your point's a good one, that if you see somebody who's a solo entrepreneur or a lifestyle business and they're talking about selling, I mean, just a little education about that can help. Michael Gerber's book, The E-Myth Revisited, which
Mhm.
is long ago published, but still valuable, is interesting. Chip Higgins has just written a book called The Bizix Way that talks about different ways of looking at building a business, momentum, velocity, and so on, what those things mean and how you do it. Both of those books really are talking about you got to build a system, to your point, that takes you out of the equation because you're not selling you, you're selling an operation that has to survive without you. And again, as a banker, if you're, just dealing with loans or deposits and you see that, just asking that one question, how are you going to get you out of the business, which you proposed, hugely valuable.
Mhm. There probably are some other things, and you've hinted at some of them. You've actually used them. If you're talking to a business owner, and it can be in any kind of situation, what kinds of things do you feel comfortable broaching when it comes to talking about the future? How would you frame something like this if you were, say, a banker talking to somebody about their future plans? And what kinds of questions might you pose?
Oh, I'd start out with something gentle like, so how are you cheating on your taxes? Maybe start there. Um, I think, oh wow, I love hearing about your story. Tell me, what was the initial idea that got you started? Why did you do this versus something else? What did you think you were going to do at the time? How has it evolved over time relative to what you initially thought? What
Mhm,
are some of the things that you've learned along the way that now influence the decisions you're making? So
mhm,
that's a past, present sort of view of things. And then the future is, so how do you see the business evolving? And at what point do you think you might want to get out?
mhm,
Um, What's your strategy for that? Do you want to close it, sell it, pass it on to somebody? What are you thinking? Walk me through the steps. How do you think you would get there? What sorts of obstacles do you see? What concerns do you have?
mhm,
Um, have you talked to anybody about selling a business like this?
mhm.
Um, I have somebody I could introduce you to if not. Um, Do you have a sense at this point of what businesses like yours sell for?
Mhm.
How does that sound to you? I mean, if you were to get that price earlier, would you go? What influences the timing of your decision to get out? I mean, I could go on, but those are all questions that relate to timing and amount, basically, of the exit and the value proposition that the business owner is thinking about, so that as a business person yourself, as a banker, you can think, doesn't really understand or has a clear picture of this. So you know where you're starting from. So questions like what would influence the timing of your departure? What influences the amount of money that you think you need? Why is that amount important? How do you think about the family's involvement between now and then? Those are all questions that maybe nobody else has asked.
Mhm.
Um,
There could be people, and I think you said this in our first conversation, which I would encourage people to listen to if they missed that. One of the things you can get somebody who doesn't really want to talk about this.
yeah, and then I think you have to have something that you've practiced, which is, okay, I get it. It's not the right time for the conversation. I don't want to intrude, but just to let you know, this is how I practice with my clients. I go through an assessment of their past, present, and future. We talk about the implications of that, the risks, what it means to do that in terms of getting financing and so on. If those conversations ever would be helpful to you, I'd be happy to have them, and I'll completely respect your thought that you don't want to talk about it now. Something that was a little long-winded, but something along those lines. I've never been accused of saying something quickly. So you have to edit me. Um,
Not very much, Nick. So I'm going to, well, thank you for taking part in this second Ned Talks on the subject of talking to business owners about exit strategies. I think we've established that both of us are interested in this topic. And I'm saying, on behalf of both of us, if there's anybody that's interested in chatting further with us, both you and I are more than willing to engage. Is that a fair promise to make to our listeners?
As long as there are large amounts of money and a nice bottle of wine involved somewhere in the equation, I'm in.
I'm sure that's part of it. So Nick, thank you again for being part of this Ned Talks.
You're welcome, Ned. Thank you for inviting me. Cheers. Bye bye.